The Christmas ornaments. The holidays had always been a favorite time of year for me, filled with nostalgia and warmth. This Christmas, my wife Caroline and I decided to spend the season in a cozy cabin we'd rented deep in the Vermont woods. We wanted an escape from the chaos of the city and a chance to reconnect. The cabin was everything we'd hoped for: quaint, secluded, and surrounded by towering pine trees dusted with snow. We arrived late in the afternoon on Christmas Eve, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows over the cabin's porch. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and cinnamon, a roaring fire already prepared for us. The living room was adorned with simple holiday decorations: a wreath over the fireplace, a string of colored lights, and a box of vintage ornaments sitting on a side table. "Look at these," Caroline said, holding up one of the ornaments. It was a glass bulb, its surface cracked and faded, but still beautiful in its own way. They must be decades old. We decided to decorate the small tree in the corner with the ornaments from the box. Each one was unique, some shaped like stars, others like bells. One particularly odd ornament caught my eye: a porcelain angel, its painted face chipped, leaving it with a lopsided, unsettling grin. Caroline hung it near the top of the tree, and we laughed about how creepy it looked. If only we had known. That night, we settled in with mugs of hot cocoa, watching the snow fall outside. The cabin felt peaceful, almost enchanted. By the time we went to bed, the world outside was blanketed in silence, the kind only a snowstorm can bring. I woke up in the middle of the night, my throat dry. The cabin was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies every creak and groan of the wood. As I padded to the kitchen for water, I heard it, a faint tinkling sound like the chime of a bell. I froze, listening. It came again, soft and deliberate. "Caroline?" I called out, but there was no answer. The sound led me back to the living room where the Christmas tree stood. The fire had died down to embers, casting the room in a dim, flickering glow. As I approached the tree, I noticed something strange. The ornaments seemed to be moving, not swaying, as if from a draft, but twitching, their fragile bodies jerking slightly. The porcelain angel at the top of the tree was no longer grinning. Its painted eyes now seemed to stare directly at me. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The ornaments stopped moving, and the room fell silent again. Convinced I was imagining things, I returned to bed, determined to tell Caroline about it in the morning. The next day, Caroline was already in the kitchen making breakfast when I woke up. "Did you hear anything weird last night?" I asked her. She looked up, puzzled. "No, I slept like a rock. Why?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "Probably nothing. Just thought I heard something." We spent the day hiking through the woods, enjoying the snow-covered trails and the crisp, cold air. By the time we returned, the sun was setting, and the cabin was bathed in an orange glow. As we unpacked the groceries we'd picked up in town, I noticed something strange. One of the ornaments from the tree was sitting on the kitchen counter. "Did you move this?" I asked Caroline, holding up the tiny glass bell. She frowned. "No, why would I?" I didn't respond. I simply placed the ornament back on the tree, feeling a chill creep up my spine. That night, things got worse. We were watching an old Christmas movie when the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Caroline grabbed a flashlight while I fumbled for matches to light a candle. As the flame flickered to life, we heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the faintest whisper coming from the direction of the tree. "Did you hear that?" Caroline whispered, her eyes wide. I nodded, slowly approaching the tree. The ornaments were moving again, their glass surfaces catching the candlelight. This time, the movements were more pronounced, as if they were trying to break free from their hooks. The porcelain angel fell from its perch, shattering on the wooden floor. "Let's get out of here," Caroline said, grabbing my arm. But before we could leave, the whispering grew louder, turning into a low, guttural growl. The shattered pieces of the angel began to move, sliding across the floor and reassembling themselves. We watched in horror as the porcelain figure rose, now standing on the floor, its cracked face twisted into something monstrous. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, its voice like wind through dead trees. The ornaments on the tree began to shatter one by one, their fragments flying through the air like tiny shards of glass. We ducked, shielding our faces as the room descended into chaos. Somehow, we made it outside, running into the snow without looking back. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest house, a mile down the road. The kind older couple who lived there let us in, their faces full of concern as we tried to explain what had happened. The husband called the local sheriff, who accompanied us back to the cabin the next morning. When we arrived, the cabin was undisturbed. The tree was still standing, its ornaments intact. The angel was back at the top, grinning down at us. "You sure you weren't just spooked by the storm?" the sheriff asked, his tone skeptical. I didn't bother arguing. Caroline and I packed up our things and left that day, vowing never to return. But even now, as I sit by our tree at home, I swear I can hear it. The faint tinkling of a bell, followed by a whisper too quiet to understand. The Frozen Choir. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. The lights, the snow, the quiet magic that seemed to permeate the air. It was all intoxicating. This year, my partner Elena and I decided to break tradition and rent a cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. A secluded winter retreat seemed perfect. No phones, no emails, just us and the snow-covered wilderness. We arrived on the morning of Christmas Eve. The cabin was idyllic, nestled between a dense forest of pine and birch trees. It was small but cozy, with a wood-burning stove and large windows that overlooked a frozen lake. It was everything I'd dreamed of except for one odd detail. A ring of old wooden crosses stood at the edge of the property, half buried in the snow. "Do you think they're grave markers?" Elena asked, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Probably just some kind of boundary or decoration," I replied, though the sight of them made me uneasy. We brought in our bags and settled in, cooking a simple dinner as the light faded. Outside, the forest grew darker and more imposing, the shadows between the trees seeming to stretch and shift. That night, the first strange thing happened. I woke suddenly, unsure what had stirred me. The cabin was pitch black, save for the faint glow of embers in the stove. I listened, my ears straining for any sound, and then I heard it, faint melodic voices drifting through the night air. It sounded like a choir. I shook Elena awake. "Do you hear that?" She groaned, annoyed at being disturbed, but when the voices grew louder, her eyes shot open. "Are there other cabins around here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Not for miles," I replied. The singing grew louder, clearer. The voices were hauntingly beautiful but carried an undertone that made my skin crawl. They didn't sound like any carolers I'd ever heard. I threw on my coat and stepped outside, the icy wind biting at my face. The singing seemed to be coming from the direction of the frozen lake. Against my better judgment, I trudged through the snow toward the sound. When I reached the edge of the lake, the singing stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. Then I saw them, faint figures standing in the middle of the ice. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself, and ran to the cabin. The next day, Elena was on edge, and I couldn't blame her. I tried to convince her that it must have been some kind of auditory illusion, but I didn't believe it myself. After breakfast, we explored the property. I wanted to check out the strange wooden crosses up close. As we approached, I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before. Each cross was carved with symbols, crude and angular, like something ancient. "These aren't just decorations," Elena said, running her gloved hand over one of them. I nodded, my unease growing. "Let's head back." That night, the singing returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. It sounded as if the voices were right outside the cabin. Elena grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to leave," she whispered. "We can't drive in this storm," I replied, glancing out the window. The snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets. The singing stopped, replaced by a rhythmic tapping on the windows. "Is someone out there?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible. I grabbed the fire poker and approached the window, peering into the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the swirling snow. Then a face appeared, pale and gaunt, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, coming from all sides now. We barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, shoving the dresser against the door. I clutched the fire poker, useless as it seemed. Around midnight, the voices returned louder than ever. They sang in a language I didn't understand, their melody twisting and warping like a broken music box. Then we heard the front door creak open. Something heavy moved through the cabin, its footsteps deliberate and slow. The air grew icy, our breath fogging in the dim light. The bedroom door rattled. "Go away!" Elena screamed, her voice breaking. The rattling stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. "Stay here," I whispered, though I didn't feel brave at all. I moved the dresser just enough to squeeze through the door and stepped into the hallway. The cabin was eerily quiet. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the living room, its back to me. It was tall and emaciated, its skin as pale as snow. Long, bony fingers trailed over the wooden crosses we'd brought in earlier, their tips leaving scorch marks. "Leave us alone!" I shouted, raising the fire poker. The figure turned its head, and I felt my courage evaporate. Its face was grotesque, the skin stretched impossibly tight over its skull, its eyes hollow and black. It opened its mouth, and the choir's song poured out, deafening and disorienting. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The cabin was silent, the storm had passed, and Elena was shaking me awake. We left that day, abandoning our belongings. I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. As we drove down the snowy road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, faint figures standing at the edge of the forest, watching us leave. I don't know what we encountered that Christmas, but I'll never forget the sound of that haunting otherworldly choir. The final carol. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. The lights, the music, the promise of warmth against the winter cold. It was everything I cherished. That's why I didn't hesitate to take up my friend Maggie's offer to house-sit her family's Victorian mansion while they were on holiday. It was isolated on the edge of a snow-blanketed forest, but the charm of the old house and its antique decorations made it feel magical. The first night was peaceful. I made myself a cup of cocoa, curled up in the grand parlor, and watched the fire crackle beneath the antique mantel. A faint melody hummed through the house. Maggie's family had an old record player, and Christmas carols drifted through hidden speakers. The second night was when things began to feel off. I was reading by the fire when the record player skipped. The cheerful notes of "O Holy Night" distorted into an unnatural pitch, dragging out into a low, droning hum. I got up to investigate, but the sound corrected itself before I reached the player. Shrugging it off, I returned to my seat, but the hairs on my neck refused to settle. By the third night, the unease had grown into something tangible. I woke to the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway outside my room. Maggie had assured me the house was secure, locked doors, bolted windows, but the steps were unmistakable. Grabbing the small flashlight I kept by the bed, I stepped into the hallway. "Hello?" My voice sounded small in the cavernous darkness. No answer. The footsteps continued, leading me down the hall and toward the grand staircase. As I reached the top, I noticed something strange, the faint strains of the first Noel playing softly, but it wasn't coming from the speakers. It sounded live. The melody seemed to drift from the parlor below, but when I reached the bottom of the stairs, the fire had gone out, leaving the room in near total darkness. My flashlight flickered, the weak beam catching the edges of something on the mantel, a line of stockings. I froze. There had been 5 stockings when I arrived. One for each member of Maggie's family. Now there was a 6th. The name stitched on the stocking read, Claire. I dropped the flashlight in my panic, the beam spinning wildly across the room before dying completely. The music stopped, and then a whisper. "Come sing with us." I turned toward the sound, heart pounding, but the parlor was empty. The faint scent of pine and candle wax hung in the air, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it all. The next morning I found the 6th stocking in my bedroom, hanging from the foot of the bed. I tried to call Maggie, but my phone refused to connect. Even the landline in the kitchen was dead, the cord frayed as if it had been chewed through. Snow had piled up outside, making the long drive back to town impossible without help. That night I locked myself in the bedroom and barricaded the door with a dresser. My plan was to wait out the week, no matter how unsettling things became. But the house had other plans. It started with the carols. Soft, haunting renditions of old Christmas songs drifted through the house, each verse slower and more distorted than the last. By midnight, the voices became layered. Men, women, and children singing in a cacophony that didn't match the melody. It wasn't just music, it was chanting. I covered my ears, but the sound was inside my head, reverberating through my skull. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a single knock on the bedroom door. Knock, knock, knock. "Who's there?" I whispered, my throat dry. Silence. I approached the door cautiously, pressing my ear against the wood. Knock, knock, knock. The dresser slid an inch forward as if something on the other side was pushing. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The air grew frigid, my breath misting in the dim light. I grabbed the flashlight, flicking it on just as the door burst open. There was no one there, but the hallway was filled with shadows, moving unnaturally against the flickering light. And then I saw them. Figures in tattered holiday attire, an old man with a twisted cane, a woman in a moth-eaten dress, children clutching cracked porcelain dolls. Their eyes glowed faintly like embers in the dark. They sang, "Silent night, holy night." The words were guttural, rasping, and filled with malice. I screamed, throwing myself out of the room and down the hall. The figures didn't chase me. They just watched, their song growing louder as I fled. I ended up in the attic, slamming the door behind me and locking it with the rusty bolt. The attic was freezing, but it was quiet. No singing, no footsteps. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I saw the tree. In the center of the attic stood a Christmas tree decorated with rotting ornaments and strings of blackened tinsel. Beneath it were boxes wrapped in decayed paper, the ribbons frayed and damp. One of the boxes was open. Inside was a cracked mirror, reflecting not the room but something else entirely, a dark forest blanketed in snow. In the reflection, figures moved among the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on me. The mirror began to hum, the sound growing louder until it felt like my skull would split. And then, a voice. "Your turn to join the carol." The figures in the mirror stepped closer, their mouths opening impossibly wide, the sound of their song pouring out like a physical force. I tried to look away, but my body wouldn't obey. I don't remember how I escaped. When I woke, I was lying in the snow outside the house. The carols were gone, the house silent, but I wasn't alone. The sixth stocking was clutched in my hand, the name Claire now stitched with my own. And faintly in the distance, I could still hear them singing, waiting for me to return.
Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.